Dexter Filkins, who goes where no other reporter goes. Our next speaker is Rajiv Maan. He is the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell Coordinator for the FBI and has one of the most important and one of the most challenging jobs in the entire Bureau. He is, like so many of the people that have passed by this podium in the course of the last 2 days, extraordinarily accomplished. 21 years in the FBI, 16 years in counterterrorism, the rest of it in counterintelligence, a stop through as the legal attaché in Jordan in the middle of the Arab Spring, and now the person who, with Ambassador Karsten, spends all his time thinking about people far away in dangerous circumstances and how to get them home. Let's welcome Raj.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here today speaking about a subject that is incredibly important. But before I get started, I'd like to give a special thanks to Ali Soufan and the Soufan Center for inviting me to say a few words before the panel. As you know, this is a small community, but an incredibly passionate community, and it is important that we have all these discussions so we can all learn from each other. The Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, HRFC, is the dedicated government's interagency coordinating body for the recovery of American hostages held abroad. The HRFC consists from professionals from FBI, CIA, NSA, Departments of Defense, Justice, State, and Treasury. One of HRFC's primary responsibility is to identify and recommend hostage recovery options and strategies to the President through the National Security Council. The way we do this is by providing an intelligence forum and open dialogue with our partners. Once a hostage is recovered, additionally, a key aspect of HRFC is our family engagement team. When someone is taken hostage, our team of experts coordinate direct support to the families. Once a hostage is recovered, the same team provides post-captivity emotional and physical support as they need time to recover to adjust to the experience. The team consists of FBI victim services coordinators, operational psychologists, crisis negotiators, State Department consular affair officers. As needed, the team can also expand to draw upon additional resources from the state regional affair officers, OD&I, and SPIA. The family engagement team is led by the family engagement coordinator, who ensures the family receives timely information and advocates for the family at the highest level of the U.S. government. Conversations with the family can be difficult, and the families are going through more than I could ever imagine. But we are committed to them, just like we are committed to bringing their loved ones home. Every time a person is taken hostage, it throws the family into crisis and chaos and impacts every level of their life: emotional, physical, spiritual, financial, and social. And let's be real, nobody plans to be taken hostage. The family members describe this as the worst moment of their lives, an emotional freefall where there are no ups short of their loved ones coming home. These families rely on the government for information, which is why our goal is to be honest and provide information with one voice. For a victim, being taken hostage is dehumanizing. Very few people understand what it is being a hostage and the daily pressures of captivity. When that day comes, and we manage to successfully recover a person held hostage, we offer trauma-informed and victim-centric post-captivity support. This post-captivity support protects and promotes health and welfare to the newly recovered victim and supports their reintegration back to family and society. It is also crucial that we collaborate with our international partners. We have seen multiple instances of complex hostage-taking, such events as the hijacking of the TWA 847, the Munich 1972 Summer Olympics, the hijacking of Akili Laro, and the most recent October 7th Hamas attack in Israel. Historically, we also observed many of these events to have diplomatic, military, law enforcement, and intelligence operations, often with little to no coordination and no synchronization between crisis site response and other countries whose citizens are held hostage. This overwhelms the country's internal capabilities. As such, the HRFC has created a Multilateral Fused Response Initiative, which is also known as MLFR, designed to foster partnerships in the international community in responding to a hostage event. The MLFR is intended to synchronize a combined response to the critical hostage incident among our international partners. The basic concept is to obtain agreements in principle with our international partners to share resources, capabilities, personnel, and materials as required for a hostage rescue or recovery. Additionally, MLFR ensures synergy of effort during a critical hostage incident that included victims from multiple nations. This would include collaborations with tactical response, crisis negotiations, intelligence collections and disseminations, law enforcement investigations and evidence collections, diplomatic engagements, public affair, media efforts, family engagement, and post-captivity support. Lastly, international terrorism remains a persistent threat that exposes innocent victims to the danger of being taken hostage. The HRFC, in partnership with international counterparts, is seeking to disseminate best practices to mitigate the likelihood of abduction. The HRFC seeks to share this information with diplomatic community, global corporations, NGO, faith-based missionary groups, humanitarian organizations, as well as the individual tourists. We continue to encourage information sharing, which is clear through our partnerships in the country. In my 28 years of law enforcement, I've never seen intelligence collection and sharing as well as hostage enterprises now, but we always have room to improve. It has been my honor to be the director of the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell for the past year, and we continue to be relentless in trying to bring all the hostages home where they belong. Thank you.
Well, Roger perfectly framed where we're going with those important remarks. The next panel is the human cost, hostages in conflict and prospects for global cooperation, which will be moderated by retired Colonel Liam Collins, PhD, Executive Director of the Viola Foundation and the Madison Policy Forum. He'll be joined by Sarah Moriarty, Fellow at the Future Security Program at New America, Elizabeth Hirsch Naftali, a hostage advocate, and Diane Foley, President and founder of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, and we all know who James Foley was, and my colleague, Mr. Adam Goldman, national security reporter at the New York Times. Let's welcome our panel.
All right, welcome to the panel. I got the pleasure of moderating the human cost, hostages in conflict, and prospects for global cooperation. I'm do a little bit longer introduction of our panelists so you kind of understand their expertise and their background in this area. So joining me is Diane Foley, who is the president and founder of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, which she created in September 2014, less than a month after a public beheading of her son by ISIS in Syria. She's been a tireless hostage and wrongful detainee family advocate within the U.S. hostage enterprise, Congress and working with Congress in every presidential administration since 2014. Also, Sarah Levinson Moriarty is a fellow at New America's Future Security Program and daughter of Robert Levinson, the longest held hostage in American history, and she's also been a relentless advocate for all American hostages, building relationships across governments and private industry. And her advocacy was instrumental in the passage of the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking and Accountability Act. Also, Liz Hirsch Naftali, who's the great aunt of Abigail Mouraidan, a 3-year-old who was held hostage in Gaza for 51 days. Abigail was kidnapped by Hamas terrorists on October 7th, 2023, after her parents were both murdered in front of her by Hamas terrorists. And then Adam Goldman, who's a reporter for the New York Times in Washington, D.C. He covers FBI and national security and has written exclusively about hostage issues for more than a decade. So, you know, I guess to start, I'd like to ask Diane, if you could just, you know, I think most of the people know, but they may not. Can you explain the terms wrongful detention and hostages?
In the U.S., for wrongful detention, that means that one of our U.S. nationals has been taken by a nation state, whereas a hostage is, in our country at least, considered someone who has been taken by a criminal group, terrorist or pirate, essentially. So.
And then this is at least a relatively new phenomenon, at least in kind of scale and scope, or at least what we're seeing today. So can you provide a little bit of background of, you know, how many Americans are we talking about, to provide some kind of scale and scope of understanding, and then who or what groups are the biggest culprits in this?
Sure. Hostage taking actually has a long history, Liam. However, we're becoming more acutely aware. And when Jim was taken in 2012, it was no hostage enterprise, if you will, in the U.S., which I was not aware of. And there was really no one who was accountable for helping. And I was quite frantic. And sent in circles, to be honest. Our government didn't know what to do with me. They really didn't. I think they tried. They kept telling me Jim was their highest priority, but they really didn't know what to do with this annoying mother who kept showing up. It was appalling, and particularly when Jim was killed, I had a lot of frustration. I really felt our government could do better. And I'm delighted to say that our government has dramatically improved in that regard. More than 130 innocent Americans have come home since 2015. So I just congratulate so many of the good people in this community made that possible. However, the challenge continues. And now the challenge, we're seeing a lot of the challenge continues from the terrorist side, obviously with the recent Hamas attack, but also nation states taking our people. So that's why the Levinson Act is so important, because it helped give criteria for how our government could, in fact, designate a U.S. national as, in fact, a wrongful detainee. So we currently are tracking about 42 wrongful detainees. However, we think there are a lot of people in a gray zone that the government has not yet designated in that regard. But when you consider that thousands of Americans are arrested all over the world for real crimes, it's a challenge for our consular affairs to find those, to narrow in on those arrests that are in fact truly wrongful. So we still have a huge challenge, then the challenge of deterrence, of course. So thank you.
Yeah, turn over to the rest of the panelists and kind of, can you explain to the audience why they should care, right? So it might not apply to this audience, but I think there are some that, if you look at some of the recent high-profile cases, some people might say that people are putting themselves to this risky positions. Why should the U.S. government, or why should we get involved in helping them out, right? For example, they might say, if Brittany Griner is going to Russia, she kind of knows the risk that she does by going over there, especially if she's carrying what the Russians might consider drug paraphernalia. Or, for that matter, anybody going to Russia, China, or Iran knows the risks. For me personally, I probably can't go to Russia based off of the work I've done in supporting Ukraine from 2016 to 2018. For me, that's probably off the table, right? Or others may say, hey, if you're living near Gaza, you know the risk, right? Or if you're going into Syria or terrorist safe haven, you know the risk. So I'll start with you, Liz, and ask you, why should people care about this, and why should the government get involved?
Well, first, thank you. And I want to say thank you to Ali Soufan and the group and everybody that's been making this possible, because first, you all are experts, you either in the field academically or professionally, but what they've allowed is for someone like myself who 11 months ago wasn't any part of this world to come here and to share our tragic story and the horrors of what happened to my family on October 7th, and also to share the miracle of what happened 51 days later. And I'll back up just to say thank you for giving me this opportunity, because it goes to why this is important, which is the work you do has human faces behind it. There are real people. And in our case, and I think about going the first time I went to the SPIHA office, and I looked, and there was no picture of a 3-year-old on the walls. There was no child that was sitting there that had been a hostage, that had been recovered. I didn't know if Abigail would be recovered at that moment, but what I did learn, and I go back to Diane and Sarah and the work they've done, and then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about your exact question, is that because of what they had done in the years before and the work of people like David Cotter and people like Roger Karstens and so many of you who I don't know the names, but you made it so that we could get Abigail released. We could get 105 women and children released after 50 days in captivity, which is amazing and a miracle, but sadly, and we'll talk a little bit later, there's still over 100 hostages. But it goes back to your question about why should people care and where should they live. And, you know, I just want to make it clear, Abigail and her family, her mother, an American citizen, my niece, was living in a country with a designated border. And Hamas came over that border, broke a ceasefire, and not only murdered her in front of her 3 children at 6:30 in the morning, and then murdered her husband a few minutes later in front of their 3 children. But this was their home, this was their country. And what I keep reminding people is that this could have been your neighborhood, God forbid. Here we are sitting here where 9/11 occurred. It should not have happened here, and it should not have happened in their community. So I just say that this is a real story. It could affect so many people here if it happened in their neighborhood. And so that's why people should care, because what happened was hate that has no borders and no boundaries.
Sure, I'll just add to that. I think people often think that would never happen to me, so we still have people traveling to these places. I think there's the popularity on things like Instagram of, I want to travel to every country in the world, and that's your son, that's your brother, that's someone that you know. And so people think, oh, that person's guilty. So when we propagate the Brittany Griner was guilty, so of course she got held, she did the crime, shouldn't she do the time? Well, that's not true. She was targeted because she was an American. And we have a target on our backs for being Americans. And I think every one of us needs to be reminded of that. We need to be crying out for our loved ones to come home from all of these places. We still have several people who need to come home from a number of places, as Diane rightly said. And we should all care, whether we're the ones directly impacted or someone that we know in the future could be impacted. The time is right now that we need to care about this. And it's been escalating. And it continues to escalate until we do something.
Yeah, Adam, I'd also like to ask you if you want to answer that, but also what drives reporters to go to, these high-risk areas where they know it's high risk? I mean, I've been in many high-risk areas, but I have a giant Department of Defense $800 billion enterprise behind me.
I'll answer both questions, but let me step back and put the other one that everybody else just talked about in context. If you're an American and you go overseas and you break the law, if the question is, well, only broke the law of another country, why should we do anything to get you back? You can make the same argument for somebody who worked in the CIA or FBI. If you're going to go over and knowingly break a country, commit espionage in China, Russia, then why should we bother getting you back? I don't think there's any difference between the two. They're both Americans, and the country's obligation is to get these people home. At least that's what I think citizens expect. And, reporters are driven to go to places, obviously, to do the basic function, which is journalism, to shed light on conflicts and inform the world and perhaps even governments and help people understand what's happening. I think what we've seen sometimes as reporters or people who are quasi-reporters or people who want to be reporters go in the war zones and get taken. We saw that in Syria, and it was very dangerous during the civil war with Syria in 2012. And I'm not referring to Jim Foley, but there were others who went into Syria and they had no business going in there. And part of the problem is the media itself had decided they were going to do a blackout, and they weren't going to talk about these abduction cases, but there ended up being 24 Westerners who had taken. And because the journalists weren't letting the world know what exactly was going on, people were wandering or going into Syria, getting picked up, and ultimately they were killed. So everybody has I think journalists have a drive to go to these places, but we also have to be smart. I've been to Afghanistan. I was just in Rafah. But when I move into these places, I have the support of the New York Times, a couple former British SAS commandos advising us, right? And there have been times in Iraq, for instance, where our advisors who are working with us literally will say, you know what, we're done. We're out of here. And they'll, as much as the reporters don't want to be pulled back, they'll pull them back and they'll pull them out of there. When the Iraqis start shelling their own positions, it's time to go. So we, at least I think reporters at the New York Times and other major news organizations spend a lot of time and put a lot of thought into where we should go and how safe it is. And by the way, when I went in the Rafah with the Israel Defense Forces, I didn't sign any forms, right? They wanted to censor me, but I didn't sign the form. So, I went in there as a free and independent journalist. They didn't like that at the end once they figured out I hadn't signed the form. But, I wanted to make sure I had my independence and they weren't going to scrutinize what it is I was going to write or photograph and show the world.
Yeah, we've had some great successes in the release of hostages and people who have been wrongfully detained, but also some horrifying and terrible failures, which is probably not surprising given, at least as you pointed out, Liz, it's not a new phenomenon. Hostage taking goes back, but kind of in its current form and scale, I think it is somewhat unique. And we've only got a short time for this panel, so I really want to focus on hostages as opposed to the wrongful detainees. So I'd like to ask the panelists, what are some best practices in bringing hostages home? And to reinforce the point, I think it's also important to think of some of those failures. Where have we got it wrong? And I think that really kind of reinforces what we can do better. So I guess I'll start with you, Sarah, if you can kind of describe what you think are some of those best practices.
So I think when we look back at since the implementation of the Levinson Act and before that PPD 30, I think we have a good organization in place, set of organizations working together, creating friction where is needed to come up with the best ideas to bring Americans home. And I think we've seen...
What organizations are you talking about? Government,
yes.
Not, third party? Like what kind of organizations?
Well, so I think we've improved on our relationships between government and third party, but I'm specifically talking about the hostage response group at the NSC, the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs at State, as well as the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell at, in the intelligence community. But I also think great improvements have been made in the partnership between public and private. I think that's what's important, is continuing to build upon those successes, learn from the failures, and keep moving forward. So when I've been studying this, I've unfortunately become an expert over the past 17 years in some ways. There's 5 different areas of hostage policy that exist. There's awareness, so how do we make Americans both aware of the risks as well as outcry, so that it pushes public pressure to bring people home. There's return, what are the actual tactical things that we need to be doing to bring people home. There's support in terms of how do we support the families as well as the hostages when they do return home. And then there's deterrence and justice. And I think we're starting to see a lot of progress in return and support, but we're not seeing as much of an impact yet, and that's where we need to start focusing, is awareness, deterrence, justice. I think we saw it with the prosecution of the ISIS Beatles in the horrific cases that happened. We saw indictments against Hamas, but we need to be doing more of that right now. We need to be turning up the heat so that we stop Americans from being taken in the first place.
I really totally agree with Sarah. I think you laid that out so beautifully. But we do have challenges, and a lot of the world looks to us, even though we had our failures in 2014, because we were able to, with the Presidential Policy Directive 30, set up the current government structure. We have had many successes, but I think one of the first lessons is we have to talk to bad guys. We have to talk to captors. We have to be willing to talk to terrorist groups, to talk to nation states. We have to be willing to talk to people who use human beings, as political pawns. So, but there are many, and we're slowly and steadily using more and more tools, but we, struggle in many ways because I think bringing people home at times is in conflict with deterring the process of, holding people accountable, getting justice, et cetera. And that can be difficult to be doing both things at once. So I think collective action, that's why I think gatherings like this are outstanding. I just think the world of Ali for doing this, for bringing us all together, because we have huge challenges that as society we need to address. And we need to be able to work with our Western partners collectively on bringing people home, but also deterring the horror of hostage taking.
So you brought up the fact that the government needs to talk to different groups, and this is not necessarily a question for you, Diane, but could be for any of the panelists. So what is the government's official policy, right? I think everybody's heard that, right, the government doesn't negotiate with terrorists, but what is the actual government policy on that? Or in practice, or the official policy and the unofficial policy?
In reality, our government is talking to terrorists all the time. In reality, our government is talking to terrorists all the time. Whether we're using proxies like the Qataris or others, we're dealing with the Taliban, the Haqqani network. That's how ultimately we get these people freed. Maybe it's a swap, which we've seen, right? We won't pay them. Right? Other countries are free to pay them. We won't. Of course, that's our policy. But we do talk to these groups, and it's important to talk to these groups. Because you need to get people home, because also you need to understand what they're doing, right? Just as a sort of policy matter. I'll say one thing back on the other question about what lessons we've learned. I've unfortunately, since Jim Foley was killed, I sort of took over this hostage beat. I've talked to dozens and dozens and dozens of too many families. I've engaged with too many families who've had their loved ones abducted. And, every single time it's a roller coaster. And, I never know what I'm walking into. Families are traumatized. And I never tell families, obviously you don't tell families what to do. I can call and say, I'm going to write about your case. Here's what I know. Families get angry at me. They don't want me to write anything. You can't publish that information. Of course, we're an independent organization, and the paper will decide what to publish, and sometimes families don't like that. But I don't tell families what to do. If I take my hat off as a journalist and comment on my experiences, I think secrecy is bad. I think the idea that families who have someone taken should not tell their story is a bad idea. And I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that, certainly in many cases, if the families go public, the terrorists are going to kill them for talking to the New York Times. I've never encountered that. And I actually think that's bogus. But families, when they don't talk, and a lot of times I understand they're fearful. The government's telling them not to talk. They don't know what to do. They certainly don't want to put their loved ones in any harm's way. The bad guys take control of the narrative, right? I see that over and over and over again. They put out propaganda videos, right? ISIS was masterful at that. Hamas has been doing. They killed the hostages. They have the propaganda videos out. The one case I've talked about, and I always regret not writing about more, was Kayla Mueller. And the argument was, well, don't write about Kayla or you'll put her in harm's way. No, people, she's in the gravest possible danger of her life. She's being held by a fanatical terrorist group. They beheaded people. They burned people alive. She couldn't have been in any more danger. The New York Times writing about her wasn't going to put her in any additional harm's way. Full stop. There was just a case a few months ago about a woman, she's Israeli Russian. She's getting her PhD at Princeton, and she was kidnapped in a suburb of Baghdad. And we found out about her, and we were going to write her, and intelligence agencies were like, "No, you can't report on this. They'll kill her." And so I was adamant we should publish, but we ended up waiting. I said, okay, well, we can wait a couple of weeks and see how this plays out. And of course, what happened? I think it was Kataib, a proxy of Iran. They put out a propaganda video of her, and what did they do? They accused her of being a Mossad. They literally took control of the narrative, and they polluted the internet with disinformation because we didn't get our story out first. And maybe you could argue that's not our right to do that, but if we had done that, right, the first thing you would have known about her was the truth, not disinformation. So I feel very strongly about that, as you can tell.
And that's what I thought,
Yeah.
Adam, too. Nobody knew or cared about Jim, and that's why I went to the media asking for help, really, to get the story out there. However, in retrospect, I think in our situation, and in some, I really think that increases the value of the person in the eyes of the captors. And
Sure.
I really think it did in the case with ISIS, because once they figured out that the U.S. wasn't going to negotiate, well, what are we going to do with these guys? We're going to use them for something. And because we'd raised the name and such, I think it increased his value, unfortunately. So we always counsel families about two sides of that coin, and to really, it's a family's decision. And I respect when the media will listen to the family, because
And
a lot of
we do, you know that.
but I respect that, Adam, because there are situations when quiet negotiations can be helpful. I've seen those cases too.
And one last thing, I will say many times, I will sit on a story, right? Certainly if there's sensitive negotiations and the government makes a credible case that we shouldn't write about it, it's a fraught period, we'll sit on it, and then when they're freed, we'll write the story.
I was just going to add that I think from my perspective, especially, I know we're not talking about wrongful detentions, but I like talking about wrongful detention, so I'm sneaking it in anyways. I think especially in nation states, it does not raise the cost, and you should speak as soon as it happens, and I think that families are often guided not to do that, and it's a mistake because it puts pressure both on that government as well as our own government to take action immediately, and the longer we wait, the more likely a bad outcome is going to happen.
And I'll jump on that because, you know, when October 7th happened, we all know that within a day there was a different narrative of what happened that was trying to break through. And it wasn't the narrative of the truth of what happened, which was that a few thousand, 3,000, 4,000 Hamas terrorists came into Israel by breaking the fence in 100 and something like 50 places. They came by boat, they flew in with hang gliders, and they had one mission, which was to rape, burn, kill, and kidnap. And so one of the things that I realized very early on, because I was in Israel that morning, I knew something was happening. The bombs were going off. We kept running to bomb shelters. And, you know, in Israel, you're kind of used to, unfortunately, going to bomb shelters, and that's part of what it is when you live there or when you're visiting. But when we realized there was something else, and I called my sister-in-law, and she didn't answer on the kibbutz at the border of Gaza, and I called my other sister-in-law, and the first thing she did was say, my niece and her husband had been murdered by Hamas terrorists, and their 3-year-old daughter had also been murdered, because at that moment, her siblings and she were the only ones that witnessed both of their parents being murdered. And the two older kids, older, 6 and 9, ran home and locked themselves in a closet for 14 hours. And the part of the story is that Abigail, at 3 years old, was in her father's arms when he was gunned down by Hamas terrorists. And she managed to crawl out. She wasn't injured, but she was covered in his blood, and she went to the neighbor, a family that she knew, her father's best friend, and he just happened to be getting out because they were all trying to stay in their safe rooms, and he had just been going out to defend this kibbutz, to defend this community, and there was little Abigail. And the first thing he saw her, she saw him, and he was wearing a khaki uniform, and she started to run because the men who had killed her parents were wearing khaki IDF-looking uniforms that they came intentionally wearing. He grabbed her and he brought her in and he put her in the safe room. 3 hours later, while he was out protecting the kibbutz and was injured, 15 Hamas terrorists came in and took Abigail, his wife Hagar, and their 3 children, paraded them off the kibbutz. They were gone for 51 days. And the reason why I tell you this story is because if we don't tell our stories, people don't know what really happened to our family. And that's just one story. 367 young people, they could have been my children in their 20s, dancing at a music festival, slaughtered, raped, pillaged, kidnapped. If we don't tell those stories, you all and the American public and the world public does not know. And I'll say a couple things. I could keep going. I could have you here for hours with the stories that I have sat with and listened to. And, you know, there's not one good story. They're all terrible, horrific stories, but they are, in the sense, good in the sense that when you hear them, you really can't forget them. But it's an important part of telling those stories so the American public and the world hears them. And I'll just say that when we had this happen, we were not told, the 246 families of kidnapped people, women, children, little kids, grandparents, we were not told what to say and what not to say. I know it's a different time, but we were told to tell our stories. And I think that if we hadn't, the narrative in the world, the narrative in the government would have been very different. And also, it would have been very hard to, like you were saying, to get a hold of what the truth was because somebody else's truth would have already been there. So I think that's an important part to keep in mind. And I'll also say it was an important part because when you go and you speak to bipartisan members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, they don't always agree on things, as we know. But one thing that we found, and that I know, Diane, you and I have talked about, is there is an agreement of nobody should be taken hostage, but that American hostages are something that both sides of the aisle are fighting for, and it can agree that that is something that, as Americans, should be our priority. So I say that, and I also go back to the different leaders that I have met with, whether it's the President of the United States, the Vice President, the Qatari Prime Minister, and the others who have met with different leaders, the Pope. The one thing that we all do is tell our story. So I'll just end on telling our stories is really a vital part of doing this work, because at the end of the day, we can just throw out there's hostages, you can talk about how many they are, but they are real people. And I'm sitting here with people who didn't get as good a results in the sense that their hostages did not return. Abigail returned, but she returned to no home, her home was destroyed, and to no parents. They were murdered that morning. So I say that if I can't tell you that story, you can't sit with it, and then you can't then help us.
Adam, you talked a little bit about, holding a story, right, based off of recommendation, maybe negotiations going on, right? I mean, it could be real or the misinformed belief that publicizing the case will somehow do this. But at the same time, right, a lot of people will say that's the government's kind of going in position, right? They always say hold it, right? They don't want to release. So how do you balance informing the public with, again, this real or misinformed belief that publicizing will somehow hurt the case? And also, right, with another tension of, right, maybe the family's telling you to publish or not publish. And so how do you kind of thread that needle of when it's appropriate? If you got the government saying don't publish and the family's kind of saying don't, but you really think it's important.
I've tangled with the government many, many, many times, okay, on any variety of things, including Bob Levinson's case, details about Jim's abuse, right, waterboarding, what they did to these guys, what ISIS did to these hostages in captivity. And, the government just doesn't get to say, oh, you can't publish that. The government has to provide a detailed position on why they shouldn't. They have to have a reasonable explanation. And if you can't defend your position, and if you can't articulate it to me, you're not going to win the argument, right? But in some cases, they have prevailed upon me, and I have withheld the story. I mean, the big one is Bob Levinson. Everybody in the media knew, many people in the media knew that her father had at one time had a contract with the CIA, right? And so I was late to this, but eventually my colleague Madeleine Puz and I figured out the whole story, okay? But it was also a story about accountability. It was also a story about how all these people at the CIA had screwed up, right? And in fact, the CIA had disciplined a handful more, right? One woman was possibly going to be prosecuted for what had happened. So, and the fact that the CIA was slow to tell the FBI that, in fact, that, oh yeah, by the way, Bob had, had a contract with the CIA, an analytical contract. He was in the process of renewing it. So, we went to the CIA and they asked for operational reasons not to hold the case. Leon Panetta, I'll never forget, pouring us coffee, sweet as can be, right? And they made their argument. I pushed back heavily, and I said it's ridiculous. Of course, the Iranians know that Bob was working for the CIA. They had this woman's name and his phone. I was like, it's not. If a New York Times reporter figured out that this happened, I'm sure the Iranians could have sat in our house and figured it out. And so, or the Pakistanis or whatever prosecutor they're going to use. And but they asked for some time for some operational thing. They were doing some things. Leon Panetta CIA asked for 6 months. And then they handed us over to the FBI. They're like, okay, you keep these rattlesnakes in the box, okay? And so the FBI kept us on the hook for it felt like another 3 years, and it literally was. And eventually, at 3.5 years, I was like, enough. And I said, we're gonna publish this story. Everybody needs to know the CIA screwed up, right? If Bob is still alive, Iran's not gonna kill him because we're just literally saying he's more valuable. We're literally only confirming to them that Bob is in fact more valuable for what a nation state does, which is a hostage swap, which is what they would want to do with Bob. And so, I went to the FBI and got in a room with a whole bunch of these guys, some who I knew for a long time, and I said, give me one reason not to publish the story. Can anybody in this room point to the fact that Bob is still alive? Give me one detail. I don't care. Go to your bosses, get it declassified. I don't care. Not a person in that room could give me a reason not to publish that story. And that is all I needed to know at the end to publish that story. And what I found out when we published it in 13 or 14, what you learned in 2020 is they knew by 13 or 14 that Bob was dead. And they only provided that information to the family in 2020. But they knew by 13 or 14, they had the intercepts that Bob Levinson had been killed. So even at that moment when we were publishing it, I didn't know that at the time, but eventually we learned that. So, that's an instance where we work and do the right thing. And, and some people thought we were wrong to do it, and I understand that, but,
If I can share,
Yeah.
I didn't forgive him until today, honestly. We had a conversation in the green room. But there was such a struggle of what kind of life did he have at that point in time. When the story came out, we were extremely upset, but at the same time, we knew my dad had no basic human rights whatsoever. And our government was just as culpable as their government at that point, and still to this day. And so I think there's a real struggle, and if I can just bring it back to the hostages, I think the most important fact is that every day matters, and our inaction is causing deaths like Hersh Goldberg Poland, and we need to be doing something right now to make a difference, to bring people home. And I think President Biden right now and his administration have an unprecedented opportunity to continue the momentum that they've seen over the past several years, to bring all Americans who are being wrongfully held home, and they need to do that.
And that's been one of the miraculous changes, that I really do feel this has been a priority of an increasing priority for our country, but as Sarah says, every day counts, as Liz was talking about, and I agree that particularly in the wrongful detainee situations, the public stories are essential. Really, because they do hold our government accountable. And in your situation, it's helped too, I think, because it's helped with our government helping with these coalitions of nations to get these people home.
Yeah.
So.
And I'll go on to say, because I think with the time that we have, and you all may know this, but there, as of 2 weeks ago, were 8 American hostages. Hersh Goldberg Poland was murdered.
Well, there's 7.
What?
Now there's 7.
Yeah, now, exactly. But he was murdered, and his body was returned. because the Israelis, when they found him and 5 other young people who were murdered, they brought their bodies back. And obviously, for the Jewish people, bringing back these bodies, for everybody it's important, but for the Jewish people, until that body comes back and until they can have a shiva, until they can have a burial, they still don't have their loved one. And so we have 3 people who were murdered on October 7th, and their bodies were dragged across the border, and they were taken as hostage. A 20-year-old young man and an older couple on their walk in an early morning. But we have 4 Americans that we believe are alive, 2 in their 20s, a young man in his 30s with 3 little girls, and a grandfather in his 60s. And I say this because they could be us, they are Americans, but there's still 100 other hostages, and many of them are dead. Many of them have died in captivity, but they didn't just die, they were murdered. They were left there to die. We saw how these 6 young people were kept for the last few weeks in a room that maybe 2 people could lay down in, that they couldn't stand up in, and there were 6 of them. And I bring this up because here we are now, and Hersh Goldberg Poland could have and should have been saved. This is a part, and I say this because I want all of you to understand, I truly believe that our Congress has done and putting on the pressure from both sides. I believe that President Biden, Vice President Harris, Jake Sullivan, Blinken, Austin, the entire team, I believe they are working very hard. But they would also tell everybody in this room they haven't worked hard enough because they're still hostages. And I can speak specifically that they are looking to make a deal. But what I've also learned, and this is about where we have to talk with everybody, and this is where the pressure comes to tell that story, is you have 2 sides. You have 2 leaders. You have the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, and you have this leader of Hamas, Sinwar. And it is neither one of them that has chosen to make a deal. It is not in their political will right now. So while we sit here and we talk about the urgency, and all of you are doing the work, and we are all struggling, and we are all speaking out, I bring it because at the end of the day, it is how do you get these 2 men who are causing this incredible, terrible situation to agree to release 100 hostages, 8 Americans, but 100 hostages, to stop fighting and to help the people who are living in Gaza. And so I come here and I speak about Abigail, this 3-year-old who was released on the 51st day. And today I think we're almost at 245 days since this has happened. We're about to hit 345 days. We're about to hit a 1-year anniversary. I don't know what is really an anniversary because that's usually something positive, but that 1-year mark. And we sit here as the families. And what I know and what all of you know is that we can't stop because we can't let those 100 people be left. We can't let them not be considered. And we are here, I am here because I'm telling our story and because it's really an important one, but I'm still in the fight. I'm in the fight like Diane and like Sarah and like Adam, which is we know what is out there, but we keep pushing. And I will end on this, which is the urgency is now. These 100 people, 60 maybe of them are alive, the urgency is now. So when I speak to you and whoever's watching on the camera, I'm saying that today is 1 day too late for all of these people. And we saw Hersh Goldberg Poland and 5 other young people be murdered. So I ramble on because I want you all to understand these are human lives. And the work that you are doing, the work that our government is doing is hugely important. But at the end of the day, you have 2 sides. You have Prime Minister Netanyahu and you have a terrorist organization led by Sinwar, and neither one is ready to make a deal.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll make 2 points on that. We have, our governments have policies. The United States has a policy toward Syria. And there's an individual named Austin Tice who is still in Syria. We don't know what happened to Austin, but he's been there a long time. And I know that family was frustrated because they wanted to alter our policy toward Syria, essentially, to get Austin home. And like in Israel, sometimes families run up against, a hardened, cold, calculating government policy. And that can be incredibly frustrating because it's not just about dealing with the Taliban in a prisoner swap, right? who you're going to release from Gitmo. It's about dealing with the country and their national security interests, and we're obviously seeing that play out with Israel and the decision that Bibi has made. I'll make one point about that. When you think about Bibi and his role in prime minister and not getting all the hostages home, does everybody remember 1976 Entebbe, when the Israelis went and freed the hostages who were taken, right? It was a dramatic commando raid. They flew to Africa and they rescued, how many, 96? I can't remember how many exactly, 93? Only one Israeli commando died trying to save those hostages. That was Bibi's brother, Yonatan Netanyahu. There's a certain irony here playing out.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I concur with all that you're saying, and we just need to remember that there are also innocent U.S. nationals being held in China. You know, we're talking 10, 15 years. A lot of the Chinese cases, we haven't been able to move on those. Russia is also has many of our citizens, many in that gray zone that haven't quite been wrongfully designated yet, but that is, you know, a huge problem. So we have hostages in a very urgent situation like in Gaza, and we have those who in a very poignant, desperate situation because of length of years and years of being held for being an American citizen, a U.S. national. So we need your help, and we appreciate all the progress that has been made.
And I'll just add on, which is one of the things that we've seen against the Netanyahu government and the Israelis is like, there's so many families that are suffering. And they don't have what I have had and the American families have had, which is a government that actually listens to them, a government that invites them. We've met with Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk, I think 15 times. Again, we don't have the hostages out, and there's secrets, and they can't share with us intelligence, but what they can do is hear us, be with us, be there to understand this tragic moment. And I go back to, you know, Roger Karstens and the folks that he works with. We have people to contact. Roger talked about it yesterday. You can call them 24/7 pretty much, and somebody's going to call you back. And while we may not solve these issues and we may not get our loved ones back as urgently as we need them, we, at least in the U.S. government at this time, have these relationships, which I see the counterparts in Israel do not have. And it doesn't bring home the hostages quicker, but it certainly makes this experience one that is a lot more bearable.
Sarah, I'll give you a chance for some closing comments.
I'm just going to do one last thought, which is I think Afghanistan is also important to mention. We have 2 Americans who are being held in Afghanistan. And if you think about it, if this was before the Taliban became the de facto government of Afghanistan, they were hostages, now they're wrongful detentions, and the line is very, very thin. And I think until we start taking decisive action to deter and also find justice for the many victims, we're going to keep seeing this happen, and we need to do that now. And I think Congress has a lot of things. There's a lot of minds that are thinking about this on a regular basis, on a daily basis, and I think we need to see that action start getting taken immediately.
Yeah, so I think, you know, one of the takeaways, like you said earlier, I think, Sarah, was, I mean, key pillars for this, right? Awareness, return, support, deterrence, and justice. So really kind of from the get-go, making sure we know they're out there, kind of the proof of life, holding them culpable. So we could just give a round of applause, thank the panelists for their time today.